Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming to the inaugural ceremony of the Anne Snitow Prize. This is a small, joyous moment in these very dark times, and we're really glad you came to celebrate with us, not just to celebrate our honoree, Premilla Nadasen, but to celebrate feminism, which continues to change and to grow, to enrich our thinking and deepen and strengthen many movements for social, racial, and economic justice. Feminism sustains us. I know it sustains me, is sustaining me through this time. So it was in this spirit to honor Anne by stoking the flames of feminism in all its intersectional forms that Leonore Tiefer and I, with Anne's consultation and blessing, first began thinking about the Anne Snitow Prize in 2018. So I want to give a special thanks to Leonore for her vision and her prodigious work on this prize. I would also like to thank our executive committee and the co-chairs of our nominating committee, all of whom participated in the selection of the winner. So if you want to just come on for a minute and wave. There they all are. Katha Pollitt, where are you? We seem to have lost Katha Pollitt, but she's also on the committee. So I think that's everybody else. Thanks for there's Katha. Katha looks very, very good. You dressed up. So thanks and goodbye. The names of our very distinguished nominating committee are in your program. The only reason I'm not asking them to wave is that we didn't rehearse with them and they might not know what to do. So our nominating committee generated almost 50 nominations, which were as varied and inspiring as feminism itself. There were so many that were so good, it was really hard to select our honoree, but we are glad that we did choose Premilla. And last but surely not least, enormous thanks go out to our generous donors, who are many of you, from $5 to $10,000. Without you, this prize would not exist. Like many of Anne's friends, comrades, and colleagues, I've often thought about her in the last year since her death in 2019. As the atrocities of the Trump presidency grow worse and his support seems to remain resilient, I've wondered, what would Anne think? What would she say? What would she think we might do now? So I went back to her writing, and I found this in her book, Visitors, An American Feminist in East Central Europe. This is it. Highly recommended, which was published in 2020 by New Village Press. In 2015, Anne took a break from teaching to go to Poland and visit friends and comrades from the network of East-West Women, which she had been working with and organizing for about 20 years, since 1990. She was going to give some talks, see friends, travel a bit. 25 years had passed since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and one country after another in the region was falling to right-wing nativist movements and increasingly authoritarian governments. These movements were attracting the many people, as Anne put it in Visitors, left behind in the 25-year neoliberal march to a market economy. She said that they didn't know in 2015 what was about to happen in the US. And there, even as feminism was making strides, reproductive rights were eroding, economic inequality was growing, and queer people were subject to increasing repression and violence. What were feminists to do? Ever the embodiment of Gramsci's pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, Anne gave a talk in Warsaw called How to Survive Backlash. And her husband, Daniel Good, later used this as a libretto for his concerto for lecturer and orchestra, which Anne performed in before her death. So Anne said in Warsaw, we don't have to worry that the multiple aspirations of many feminisms will evaporate and disappear. We survive backlash because being part of all great movements of liberation gives us lives of significance. We are people who believe that human beings can change their situation. To believe that and to act on that belief, even with skepticism, is to have an extremely exciting and kinetic relationship, not only to ourselves, but to the world. Premilla, perhaps out of a surfeit of humility, has decided not to speak until she is in her conversation with Barbara. So I just want to quote from a really nice interview that Ms. Magazine did, and it just came out today. You can see it in Ms. An interview with Premilla. And in it, she said, contrary to what some people say, most feminists with intersectional perspective are not preoccupied with identity politics. Rather, we are concerned with building a new, more egalitarian and socially just society. The significance of that work is not just about liberation for women, but a new politics for us all around democratic engagement, racial justice, environmental justice, economic security, and respect and compassion for other human beings. With that, I would like to introduce Dr. Barbara Ransby, who nominated Premilla and who will introduce her. And I'm very much looking forward to their conversation about the politics of care later in the program. Barbara Ransby is a distinguished professor in the departments of African American Studies, Gender and Women's Studies, and History at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Also at UIC, she directs the Social Justice Initiative, a project that promotes connections between academics and community organizers doing work on social justice, which of course is precisely what this award is about too. Barbara is the author of many books, most recently Making All Black Lives Matter, Reimagining Freedom in the 21st Century. And she is herself a powerful voice in movements for social justice. So Barbara, I hand it to you now. Thanks.
Thank you, Judith. I really appreciate that introduction. And, I've had a lot of things to show up for this week, and this is one I was really looking forward to. And I was quite touched by Judith's, the quote that Judith read from Anne, surviving backlash. I mean, how prescient, how relevant to this moment. So earlier today, Premilla sent me a little note saying, thanks for doing this. I know there's so many other things to do. And I kind of chuckled to myself because, of course, it is an honor and a delight to be able to sing her praises and celebrate her as a recipient of the Anne Snitow Award. Because, Premilla's work really embodies, I think, what Anne's life embodied. I did not know her well, but I have thought a lot about her writings and her presence and her reputation. And Premilla seems to be the perfect recipient in my view. So I'll just take a few minutes to introduce Premilla Nadasen, and then we'll engage in conversation for the next half hour or so about her work, and most importantly, really about the moment we're in, because I think her work speaks to that moment in very powerful ways. Premilla is an amazing feminist scholar, activist, whose adherence to Black feminist principles is as admirable as the rigor and brilliance of her scholarship. I have known her for many years, and I have to say I've known some pretty amazing women in my life. She is indeed one of the most amazing. She did her undergraduate work at University of Michigan, which is where I met her. I was a graduate student. She was an undergraduate. We were in the Free South Africa movement together. She later did her PhD at Columbia University and then later taught at Queens College. She joined the faculty of Barnard College in 2013, and there she is affiliated with the American Studies program, as well as the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program. She teaches researches and writes about race, gender, social policy, and organizing. Her work has won numerous awards and honors. She is currently writing a highly anticipated biography of the South African singer, artist, and activist Miriam Makeba. Premilla is a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. She serves on the Scholarly Advisory Committee of the New York Historical Society Center for Women's History. She's on the editorial working group of the journal Souls, and is the immediate past president of the National Women's Studies Association. Premilla has bridged academic and activist work, not only by making her scholarship accessible to people outside the university, but by collaborating with activist organizations and recognizing the reservoirs of knowledge beyond the campus. She has been a museum consultant, has written op-eds for many different newspapers and magazines, and served as an expert witness before the New York State Assembly Committee on Labor. At the moment, she's collaborating with the Institute for Policy Studies and the National Domestic Workers Alliance on the We Dream in Black project to organize Black domestic workers. And she has had a program for many years where she takes students to the state of Mississippi to meet and work with organizers, domestic workers and others organizing in Mississippi. She is the author of author/editor of 4 books: Household Workers Unite, The Untold Story of African-American Women Who Built the Movement, which was published in 2015, Rethinking the Welfare Rights Movement, published by Routledge in 2012, Welfare in the United States, A History of Documents, co-authored with Jennifer Middlestat and Marissa Chappelle, published in 2009, and then Welfare Warriors, her inaugural book on the welfare rights movement, which has been taught so widely and influenced so many of us in all kinds of ways. So, I mean, that is her formal introduction. But what I admire most about Premilla is that she has taken so seriously the mandate for activist, engaged feminist praxis. It is not just about writing articles and books and teaching courses. It is about trying to understand the world through a feminist lens, through a Black radical feminist lens. It is about trying to negotiate and navigate and forfeit some of the privilege that we have working in the academy, so that we bring other scholar activists, other wise people in our movements and in our communities, into the circle of our students, into the circle of our colleagues, and also to influence our own thinking. And she has been just an absolute model for that kind of radical inclusivity. So I'm really happy that she is my colleague, my comrade, my friend, my sister. I'm so delighted that she was chosen as the recipient of this award. And I'm really excited to be in conversation with her for the next half hour or so. So Premilla, maybe you will join me on the Zoom stage and we can chat.
Hi, Barbara. Thank you so much.
Congratulations.
It's really nice. Thank you, Barbara. It's nice to be in conversation with you. And I also just want to say thank you to the executive committee and the nominating committee. It is a real honor to be awarded this prize, named after the pioneering feminist Anne Snitow. So yeah, I'm thrilled to be here, and more importantly, I hope we have a enriching conversation today about care work feminism and this political moment that we're in right now.
Absolutely, yeah. No, this committee has been so conscientious and careful and thoughtful and gentle. It's been actually lovely to watch. So Premilla, you and I go way back.
Decades.
Decades. I mean, we don't have to say how many, but I have watched your activist career, your academic career evolve. Have been involved with you in many, different projects, and kind of applauded and cheered on things that you've been involved in that I haven't. But our work together goes back to the Free South Africa Coordinating Committee at the University of Michigan, back when apartheid was still entrenched in South Africa. And we really didn't know that it was going to end anytime soon, which to me is actually a hopeful, thought and memory, because of course, where we stand at any given historical moment, we don't know what comes ahead, but what we do makes a difference. You and I went on to work in the United Coalition Against Racism, African American Women in Defense of Ourselves, the Black Radical Congress, Ella's Daughters. You were one of the first, I think the first director of the Ella Baker Nelson Mandela Center for Anti-Racist Education at Michigan. And then your leadership at the National Women's Studies Association. And now we work together in Scholars for Social Justice. So a long journey of sisterly comradeship and collegiality. And I've been so enriched by our relationship, I have to say. You know that personally, but I just take this opportunity to say it publicly. So it is very easy to honestly and freely sing your praises. So yeah, so how has, all this activism, it makes you seem older than you are, but all this activism has really informed your scholarship in important ways, right? Do you want to say a little bit about that? How has your commitment to social change impacted the kind of work that you've decided to do as a feminist scholar and a professor of history?
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. Yeah, we do go back, quite a ways in terms of our political commitments together. It's interesting you raised the example of Free South Africa in that moment when in the 1980s, it seemed like the South African government was becoming even more entrenched in terms of its commitment to apartheid and the ways in which it was bearing down on the political resistance. And so I think that has lessons for us in this moment right now. And I think as I think about my own kind of activist career, I went into academia because of my activism, because I started organizing at the age of 17. And so I decided to become an academic because I thought I could make a difference. I think there's a lot of lessons I learned. I guess the core one is to think about why my academic work matters. Right? I mean, the question for me that I think that guides all of my academic work is, why does this work matter? How does it impact the political moment? And how is my work being informed by the activism around me? My first book on the welfare rights movement actually emerged out of a project that we had at the Baker Mandela Center in the 1980s, an oral history of Black women in Ann Arbor. And that was where I first learned about the welfare rights movement. I didn't learn about it in my classroom. I learned about it through my organizing. And similarly, my project on domestic worker organizing really came from my witnessing and my participation in domestic worker rights organizing in New York City at a moment when in my history books and in journals, I was reading about the demise of the labor movement. So there was a real disjuncture there for me between what labor historians were saying on the one hand about the demise of the labor movement and what I was witnessing on the ground with domestic workers who were organizing. So I think our questions have to be constantly animated by the activists' work that we're engaged in.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true. You know what I'm reminded of? I've used this example a number of times, but it just comes to me as you're speaking. When Supreme Court Justice Sotomayor was being, vetted for the Supreme Court, they dug up all the dirt that they could on her to discredit her. And one of the things that became most controversial was a statement that she made, which was, I can't quote it exactly, but it was something like, a wise Latina might bring knowledge to a particular subject or a particular case that a white man might not, it was something like that. And of course, justice is blind, and, we can't have any identity politics. And this, there was a real reaction to that. And I thought to myself, really what that was about was that we're prepared to bring women of color into institutions and into positions of power, as long as they don't bring their grandmothers with them, as long as they don't bring their people with them. Like, don't bring your people up in here, but so as long as she was willing to sort of conform to the way things were done and simply be a cosmetic change, that was okay. But if she was going to actually talk about a different standard and a different way of doing things and a different measure of understanding the world and justice, that was going to be, a problem. And I think you bring your whole self into this work, like growing up in, having been born in South Africa, growing up in a family of, immigrants and activists, and, navigating your own way and figuring out what does it mean to be who you are in this work. You've never forgotten that. And I think that's so important. I don't know if you want to say anything about it or or if,
Yeah.
if that resonates for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we have to bring our work, we have to bring our full selves into our teaching, into our research. You know, one of the things that has animated my writing and my activism is to think about the meaning of theory, right? And we often associate theory with white male academics, often from Europe, you know, who are writing books that are often very difficult to understand. But, you know, my research about welfare recipients and domestic workers, when you read the words, and same of the Combahee River Collective, right? These are activists on the ground. These are women who are articulating very complicated ideas about what we call intersectionality now, about the transformation of the labor movement, about economic transformation, about the status of the economy at this moment. And so I think we have to think in a much more expansive way about what is our academic body of knowledge, what kinds of ideas are we going to draw upon. And I think one of the things that women of color academics have done is to draw on that history and to draw on the words of the people who are often outside the academy, because ultimately, I think what we're trying to do is to break down the barriers between those inside and outside the academy, because the academy, of course, reinforces and recreates the inequalities of society. And I think if we, unless we make, you know, unless we're very intentional about thinking about how to bridge the gap between campus and community, it will continue, those boundaries will continue to harden.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this is the challenge to be, as Ella Baker taught us, outsiders within. I mean, we have gender and women's studies and sexuality studies in the academy, not because people who were entrenched inside universities called for it, but because people who were excluded demanded a change and demanded opening up. You know, where I teach at University of Illinois, I had a colleague, Sterling Plump, who is a wonderful poet in what is now the Black Studies program. And, you know, I said to him, you know, sort of, how did you come into the university? He said, the people on the west side of Chicago hired me. And what he meant by that was, it was a protest movement. It was a movement external to the academy that put pressure, you know, that opened up the academy for the spaces, you know, that we all now occupy. And that is certainly as true for feminist studies, for feminist scholars who were not legible, you know, to white male academics who didn't have time for, I mean, they had time for gender, but it wasn't a feminist gender analysis at all.
Yeah, and those movements from the 1960s and the 1970s were fundamentally about holding colleges and universities accountable, right? And as much progress as we've made, because there are more people who look like us in the academy, it's still an ongoing struggle, right? One that you're involved in, one that I'm involved in, but how do we continue to hold colleges and universities accountable? There's a major tuition strike that's about to happen at Columbia University, with over 4,000 students have pledged to not pay tuition to Columbia. It would be the largest student strike in history. And, you know, and I think those struggles that are happening today about the high rates of tuition are similar in that they are about holding the university accountable.
Right, right. And it speaks to the expansive nature of feminist politics, right? Because I know, you know, and I know, you know, my daughter, Asha, was, you know, an activist, student activist at Columbia, young queer Black feminist organizer, you know, involved in the divestment, you know, movement, divestment from private prisons. And I know many of the young people involved in the current strike have a feminist framework that is radically inclusive. And that is what is so exciting. They are saying, you know, as women, as femmes, as LGBTQ folks, we are not going to be excluded. Our issues are not going to be excluded, but our issues are not limited, right?
Yeah.
So that is very exciting.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to point out, Barbara, because you know, the kind of organizing that you and I did at when I was an undergraduate at Michigan was around South Africa, was around the anti-racist movement, but was also a feminist politic. We were very intentional about the kind of Black feminist politics that shaped the work that we did. And so I think it does speak to what our fundamental definition of feminism is, right? So feminism is not something that is distinct or divorced from the politics of labor or the politics of race or the politics of imperialism. And so our feminist politics, and I think of many women of color today or women today, is really about developing a broad-based radical feminist agenda that is committed to social transformation on multiple levels.
Absolutely. Let's segue to talking about some of the specifics of your scholar activism, because it is related to all of the larger meta questions that we're talking about. There's been a lot of discussion about care work and care workers recently, you know, with the COVID pandemic, and we'll talk a little bit more about this urgent political moment. But the COVID pandemic is a part of that. And so essential workers have been talked about in all kinds of sometimes problematic ways. But you have thought very, very deeply about this question of care workers and care work and the language we use to describe that and the organizing models that we employ, deploy, and support. So what do you think the pandemic has revealed about care work, and how do you weigh in on all of that?
Yeah, the pandemic has, I think, been really critical for exposing the contradictions, many of the contradictions that we see in our society that have been around for a long time, but it's really exposed it in a very stark way. There is a multi-layered crisis of care in this country right now around health care for sure, around family care, both elder care as well as child care, community care. There's a crisis for care workers and essential workers. I think one of the responses that we've seen that's been prevalent is the hero narrative, right? This idea of thanking people who are frontline or essential workers. Here in New York at 7 o'clock last spring, every evening, you know, the people would clap, we'd clap, right? As a way to thank the service workers. There were public service announcements. But I think that these platitudes of gratitude, as I say, are not enough. And one of the questions we have to ask is, who is taking care of the care workers? It's not enough to say that people are here and are providing a service for us. There's been a language of, I think, kind of the universality of care, mutual vulnerability. We're all in this together. We all need care. We all provide care. But I think we need to interrogate the politics of care a little bit more. So with these essential workers, even though they're essential, they're necessary, they're also considered disposable. The people who are on the front lines are often not given the protective equipment that they need. They're underpaid. They often don't have health insurance. So they're having trouble sustaining themselves. And this, I think, it harkens back to an earlier politics that domestic workers experienced. And I'm thinking in particular about the language of one of the family, where domestic workers were recognized as invaluable, but were underpaid and exploited and treated with disrespect. So I think at the end of the day, what we have to do is we have to think not just about caring for people, but about the question of justice and about the question of equity. And that is about adequate wages. It's about healthcare, about ensuring people access to quality education, access to affordable housing. And the care sector, or I prefer to say service sector, or I prefer to say essential workers, is one of the most important sectors in the country today. So manufacturing workers are only about 8% of the American workforce. The service sector is 80% of the American workforce. So it's more important than ever that we really think about how to provide basic supports, not only to service workers, but to everyone.
Absolutely. I mean, I think your work so importantly, kind of contextualizes essential work, service work. But I mean, domestic work. I mean, let's call it what our mothers and grandmothers called it. My mother and grandmother both worked as domestic workers. You have family members who worked as domestic workers over time. And I think what it does is it pushes us to also analyze and challenge and interrogate this notion of kind of a universal sisterhood, that we're not just all in this together on the same plane because we're women. Some women are working for other women under very, very adverse circumstances, and analysis of domestic work brings that to the fore. Like you say, we're not just all in need of care. Some of us are providing care and in need of care. Many domestic workers need somebody to take care of them, right? And they're providing oftentimes very, very tender and skillful care to others. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So absolutely. So, in fact, I know a number of domestic workers who are taking care of elderly patients who are elderly themselves, who are in their 70s,
Yeah.
but who are providing care for someone else.
Yeah.
And I think the contradictions of feminism and care work has really animated the history of the women's movement since the 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the things that happened in the 1970s, and Angela Davis writes about this, is when more and more middle-class women entered the workforce, right? We didn't at the same time see universal daycare. There was a struggle for universal daycare, but it was not successful. We didn't see socialized housework. And what ended up happening is the greater privatization of household labor, because middle-class women hired domestic workers to do that work in the house for them. So what it did is it created a greater divide among women based on race and class. So some women were able to progress in part because of the labor of other women.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. Let me ask you this. I know, I think to myself sometimes, people ask me questions about how my own career as a feminist scholar has evolved. And I have to say, many of my most stimulating, provocative, challenging intellectual experiences have occurred outside the academy. Meeting with people when you and I both worked in the Free South Africa movement, meeting with people from South Africa who were involved in a life or death struggle, to end apartheid. Our own, I recently went to Haiti a year or so ago and met with people there, including feminists there, who were not academics, but were really trying to understand the world in such complex ways. I mean, what have been some of your experiences like that in traveling to Mississippi and working with the domestic workers in New York? I'm not trying to impose my conclusions on you, but I know you, and I know this is true for you too. How have those people been also your teachers and mentors?
Yeah, I have learned a great deal from the people outside of the academy who I have worked with, collaborated with, co-taught with. The group in Mississippi, the Mississippi Low Income Child Care Initiative, is an organization based in Biloxi, Mississippi, made up of Black and white women who are working together to try to lobby the state of Mississippi to expand welfare assistance for poor women. And I collaborated with them over a few years, and I taught courses with them. My students and I traveled down to Mississippi. We developed an index of women's economic security in Mississippi, which the organization could then use in their lobbying effort. And it was a course designed specifically to assist them in their work.
Right.
But I have to tell you that the first time I taught that course was Trump's first year in office. And we traveled around the state of we traveled around the state of Mississippi, into the Delta, to Jackson, all over the state. And I was really impressed with the level of organizing that I witnessed in Mississippi. And, you know, we have sometimes these red state, blue state sort of images in our mind of Mississippi being a state that's red, that's Republican, where there really isn't anything going on. But I think we have to sort of look beyond that and see what's happening on the ground. There's some amazing work happening in Mississippi, and not just in the city of Jackson and not just in the city of Biloxi. The Nully Jenkins Family Center in Durant, Mississippi is run by a woman named Ellen Reddy, who has started a center for girls that is transformative in so many ways. She brings girls to her space, but it's also about creating a liberatory space for them on so many levels. And so I think, you know, I mean, I think that the ways in which we understand liberatory politics has to be, and for me, is informed by the people I have met in different parts of the world. And I would say the same thing about our trip to Palestine several years ago. It was going to Palestine and meeting with grassroots organizations there that really helped us see in a really tangible way the ways in which the resistance movement has been organized.
Yeah, I'm absolutely glad you brought that up. I meant to do so. We had a Black, Indigenous, and Feminists of Color delegation that you and I and Angela Davis and Beverly Guy Sheftall and Gina Dent and a small group of feminist scholar activists participated in, and it was really truly transformative. Premilla, I want to kind of go from the scholarship to the urgency of the moment. We would be remiss if we didn't talk about all of what's transpired. I mean, we began thinking about this conversation we would have today a number of months ago, and little did we know so many things would change, so many spectacles would unfold, so many challenges for feminists, for activists, for Black people, people of color, conscientious folks in general. In this moment of, you know, it's the moment of an electoral transition, but also, I don't know how we name it, you know, and I've been in way too many conversations about how we name it, but the events of January 6th, I would call it a white nationalist attempted coup, which we can offer a feminist critique of, right? That there were women involved on many different levels in that. You know, there was the woman who was shot by the Capitol Police, former veteran. There was a woman who a military officer who led a group of 100 people from North Carolina to participate in that. So right-wing women who participated in this event. But I would argue that it was both white supremacist and misogynist patriarchal spectacle in many different ways. I don't know if you agree with that, but what are some of your thoughts about the violence that unfolded on January 6th, what the implications are for feminist activists, the Black freedom movement, progressive left movement in general?
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with you, Barbara. I think it was white supremacist, it was misogynist, and it was nationalist all at the same time. I think, you know, as we both know, that women can be supportive of white supremacy and misogyny just as men can be feminists in their politics, because it's really about a political orientation and not about your identity or your gender. Yeah, it was frightening, quite honestly, what happened on January 6th. And I think it was not completely unsurprising. There has been a growing white supremacist movement for many years now. And it's a result of the growing economic divide, of the shredding of the safety net, the concentration of wealth, and the really racist rhetoric that has been so much a part of our political discourse for years now. I guess I think part of why that happened is because people are losing power. White working class people in this country get the sense that they are losing power. And I think their ineffectiveness in the political arena led them to want to find other means to wield power. I think the real danger of what happened is the ways in which they acted with impunity. And so it was the collusion by troops, the army, the Air Force who were allied with them, the police. And so I think we have to think about the ways in which there is a kind of structural support for that white supremacist politics. So it's not just the individuals who happen to be there, but it's the system and the structure that has really supported them. And of course, the contrast between the ways in which the movement for Black Lives protests were targeted and repressed over the summer, and the ways in which the individuals who were there at the Capitol on January 6th were literally allowed to walk in and walk out is indicative of the ways in which there's structural support for that kind of white supremacy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and when we take this to a global level, and of course, we're both historians, so we don't subscribe to the notion that history repeats. Every historical moment is unique, but there are patterns and there are lessons from movements around the world. I was really struck by a conversation with Walden Bello, the Filipino sociologist and activist, recently, when he talked about Chile and Italy before Mussolini, and even Germany when the Nazis were first coming to power, that there was this kind of muscular, very masculinist fight in the streets, right? Fight in the streets for what white men felt was theirs, which was the country, which was a sense of entitlement, et cetera, in these different places. And even when women are present, even when women and femmes are present, it's really about subscribing to and proving oneself in a very masculinist, violent, misogynist context. And I say misogynist, and people may say, "Oh, were these people women hating?" I think the notion of white male entitlement is a form of misogyny, that this doesn't apply to other people. We control this. The rules don't apply to us, etc. And the fact that this movement has rallied around, Donald Trump, who grabs what he wants, takes what he wants, operates above the law, from grabbing women, which, he's talked about grabbing women's genitals as a marker of his privilege as a wealthy celebrity, grabbing power, claiming he's won things that he hasn't by the rules that exist. Like all of this is a part of the frame, the narrative frame, the political frame around which those crowds rallied, felt empowered, moved on the Capitol, and so forth. So I think a feminist analysis is very, very relevant to how we break this down.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think it's fundamentally this right-wing white supremacist movement is about shoring up a particular vision of a certain kind of society, right? A capitalist, heteropatriarchal, white supremacist society. And so, yeah, gender, I think, is absolutely central to the ways in which they imagine what making America great again means to them. But I also think feminism is really important in this conversation because feminism is our way out. And when I said that I think that these people were there in part because they feel like they're losing power, if we think about the kind of organizing that's happened over the past decade or so, a lot of this organizing has been led by women of color, whether we're talking about domestic workers or the Fight for 15 movement, the environmental justice movement, the movement for Black Lives. We have been in a place where the push for social transformation, for a better, more socially just society has been led by and large by women. And so I think that this is a moment of rupture, right? It's a moment of, or as Arundhati Roy says, right, the pandemic is a portal, a moment of transformation. And I think the people who were in the Capitol last week know that, and that's precisely what they're afraid of. But I think the question before us is, where will this transformation lead? Where will the rupture lead? And I think there's been a wave of organizing over the past 10 years. And there's also been a wave of organizing over the past year since the pandemic started. You know, my reading of history, and I'm sure yours too, is really about the ways in which mass organizing and social movements have helped determine the direction of social change. So when we look at the 1930s, you know, FDR didn't come into office with an agenda of transformative change. He was really trying to prop up and support big business. And it was through the protests and the organizing, the unemployed workers movement and the sit-ins, the worker sit-ins, and all of the sharecroppers organizing that led to the creation of a really strong social safety net for workers. Same thing in the 1960s. John F. Kennedy didn't come in with a transformative agenda, but it was a mass organizing on the ground that really pushed the country to a place where it had to grapple with the politics of race and pass legislation. And so I think that's what we can sort of think about in this moment, is how is the feminist organizing that we've seen happening, how is that going to lead us to a new kind of transformative vision of the kind of society we want?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I think it's important to recognize that might not be obvious to everyone on the surface is what we saw on January 6th was in some ways a response to Black Lives Matter, to the movement for Black Lives. It was, you know, the anger in terms of feeling that the country is being taken over, the language that Trump deployed about, you know, cities that, you know, are out of control, and describing in the ultimate disparaging terms, Black Lives Matter. I use Black Lives Matter loosely because the organizational iteration of Black Lives Matter in this moment is the Movement for Black Lives, which is a very specific coalition of 170 Black-led organizations. It was a response to that. And everybody probably knows this, but one of the most significant things that we as feminists should recognize in this moment, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Movement for Black Lives Coalition, is led by feminists, feminists not without opposition, but young Black feminists, many of them queer, not all of them, but many of them queer, but all of them feminists, with this radical, you know, intersectional approach, with Ella Baker's decentralized leadership approach, with a kind of determination not to have another charismatic male leader at the helm. They embraced Angela Davis when she went to Ferguson and rejected Al Sharpton. You know, so this is, you know, these are our daughters. These are our daughters. You know, to understand this moment as a reaction to a movement led by young Black feminists, and to see the antithesis of that on January 6th in the form of this, you know, white nationalist attempted coup / insurrection, is very much a part of the charge of those of us concerned about social transformation and just transitions, you know, in the society as a whole from a feminist perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the Black Lives Matter movement was certainly, I think, a motivating factor for how and why people organized the way they did, to the extent that they did, why they have so much investment in Donald Trump. But I think it's also true of the immigrant rights movement, right? Being led by women of color, and the labor rights movement. And I distinguish between the union movement and the labor movement, right? So the union movement, I think, is an establishment movement, not in all cases, in some cases. But the labor movement, I think, is much more expansive. So when we think about labor organizers and labor activists, they may or may not have a union card. They may or may not have joined a union, but they are still very much labor activists. And I think it's true of many Black Lives Matter activists as well, who are involved in the labor movement, but who are also engaged in the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I think the most progressive, the most cutting edge organizing that we see happening right now is happening by Black queer women and by women of color. And that is precisely the threat that people on the right see in terms of why they're losing power. Is their vision of making America great again is about clamping down on these kinds of social movements.
Yeah, I mean, the forward looking versus the backward looking too, you know, is a very basic basic way to see it. I've been very you know, privileged to work with the movement for Black Lives, but very heartened. And let me just say, it is not perfect. These are human beings, so they, you know, they are flawed like all of us. But so there are mistakes, you know, there are things that are not as we would like to script it. But on the whole, it is what we have hoped for in terms of a movement that doesn't throw anybody under the bus. You know, you mentioned the immigrant rights movement. So I work closely, you know, with the Rising Majority, which is a coalition that was founded by Movement for Black Lives. One of the heroes of that work is Gresa Martinez, who is a queer, undocumented organizer, leader now, director of United We Dream. Fearless, tireless, gentle, kind, brilliant, all those things, all those things. And that's a hard person to be. I mean, it sounds lovely to say, but to hold all of that, right? You know, and to do that work every day is a very hard job, and she's doing it, and certainly one of my heroes in this work.
Yeah.
So Premilla, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say one thing, and I really appreciate you saying, you know, movements that make mistakes,
Yeah.
that don't always know how to go forward. And, you know, I think that's true of all movements historically, right? Is that I think it's one of the things we have to accept as we see ourselves as part of these movements, is that mistakes will be made, and we learn from our mistakes, and we try to, you know, set ourselves on the right path. But I think it's part of the process because, you know, movement organizing is a struggle. It's a struggle on a sort of micro level, and it's a struggle on a macro level. You know, and I think about, you know, Anne Snitow's work about the unpredictability of feminism, right? And it is that we have to be adaptable, we have to be malleable, we have to think about how we can sort of shift our politics, adapt our politics to the political moment. And I think that's probably the best lesson we can take away right now.
Right, right. Yeah, I'm glad you brought Anne, you know, back into the conversation, because that idea of, you know, making mistakes, but also, you know, just this award. I mean, you know, for her to, you know, participate in some level, to, you know, for all those people who loved and respected her so much, you know, to participate in this tribute to her, like what, you know, what better way to carry on our work, right, than to think of affirming and supporting and embracing, you know, even beyond our own careers and lives, those people who will carry the work on. I mean, what greater tribute, really. Yeah, so that's very special. Premilla, the final thing I think I want to ask you, and then maybe we'll turn it back over to Judith, but this is, you know, you and I have been friends for all these years, but we're so busy, we don't have the luxury of this conversation. We're having a very, I feel like it's a very intimate political conversation with about 200 people listening in. But you know, I'm so excited about this new biography you're doing. You know, I believe in biography, you know, I've that's been my genre. And I was so thrilled when you said you were doing this work on Miriam Makeba. And just, I know that in this COVID crazy moment, you are not probably doing it full steam, but can you just whet our appetites a little bit in terms of what you're exploring, what you hope to accomplish with this project, what you've discovered so far that you think is, interesting and important. And I think we'll take any final comments after that, but I would just love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, well, I have not had a chance to make much progress on the biography, but Miriam Makeba was a fascinating figure. She was someone who was exiled from South Africa in her late 20s, had her passport revoked. And so in a sense, she considered herself homeless, right? Always wanted to go back home. But I think of her as someone who had multiple homes. She had 15 different passports. So there were so many places around the world where she was embraced, where she was loved, where people invited her to come live and take and be a part of their communities. She was someone who I think has been kind of excised from the history of Black transnationalism and from the international anti-apartheid movement. I really think we need to, and there are other scholars who've done this, but really think about the politics of gender as it relates to Black transnationalism and the anti-apartheid movement. I was at a museum in England last summer on the anti-apartheid movement. There was not a single mention of Miriam Makeba. Yet she was critical in terms of really bringing people into the movement, I think through her music and through her activism.
Right.
And she took a lot of risks. When we talk about the difficulty and, really sacrificing, she is someone who sacrificed a great deal to stand on the right side of political issues. So I'm excited about it. I'm looking forward to some time to continue to write. But yeah, I think she has a lot to teach us about citizenship, about activism, and about transnational organizing.
So excited to read that. So excited to read that. I mean, no pressure.
Yeah. It'll be a little while.
Well, these stories, and I know you'll have this approach to it, but these stories of women's lives and all their complexity. I mean, the thing I always find exciting about feminist biography is that in the middle of navigating relationships, earning a living, dealing with sexual harassment, and all the things that we deal with as women in a patriarchal and misogynist world, people make history. People make art. People create brilliant scholarship. I mean, this the juxtaposition of the ordinary and the extraordinary, right? That feminist biography, sort of brings us down from this exalted, superhuman story of people who don't resemble anything we know about life, but people who were, in the, having the gritty life experiences that all of us have, and still pulling back to produce something for the collective good and really advancing history in important ways.
Yeah, it's amazing to me because Miriam Makeba was someone who, from her own point of view, experienced a lot of pain and loss. She was separated from her daughter for a few years, and then her daughter died when she was fairly young. She was separated from her mother. And so she always articulated herself as experiencing loss and pain. But despite that, despite the pain she felt, she still managed to commit herself to political liberation for Black people in South Africa, but really everywhere around the world when she became involved in the Black Power movement in the United States. So in that sense, she was an incredibly inspiring person.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm reminded of two things. So I'm doing a little multitasking here, which I'm known for and you're known for. In the chat, there's all these fabulous women and others who are making comments and so forth. And I was very remiss not to point out that you were, you held a very prestigious and important chair at Brooklyn College. I think inspired by Shirley Chisholm. And I remember when you had that. I didn't include that in your bio introduction, but I just want to mention that because it was, it is very important. And Barbara Winslow reminded us in the chat. And then someone else is asking the question, about Movement for Black Lives and radical progressive organizing, and what is the threat that it represents to the liberal establishment, not just to conservatives. They mention Justice Democrats, who I support and love. Alex Rojas is fabulous. But given that Movement for Black Lives is not a narrow identity politics proposition, but really, represents in its best, this expansive vision for change, what does that represent as a kind of challenge / threat to centrist Democrats?
Yeah, and that's a question for my colleague Abosede George. So thanks, Abosede, for that. Yeah, I mean, we know there's a huge gulf between the radical activists who we're talking about, the Movement for Black Lives, domestic workers, the immigrant rights activists, and the liberal establishment. I mean, even the Bernie supporters, right? So there's a way in which I think we have to really grapple with the kind of social transformation we want to see. I don't think it's going to happen. And you and I think we've had many conversations about this, Barbara, but the kind of social transformation we want to see is not going to happen, as far as I'm concerned, under the Democratic Party. Biden is not going to sort of push us in that direction. And so I guess the question is, how do we continue to build? How do we continue to build at the grassroots level? And how do we see that transformative change happening? I don't think it can happen through electoral politics. I think we have to think about other ways of social transformation, other forms, other ways to exert pressure. So I do think and we've seen evidence of this, the ways in which the liberal establishment has tried to clamp down on some of the more radical and progressive elements, both within the Democratic Party and outside of the Democratic Party. The Democrats have been complicit in the dismantling of welfare and the criminalization of the Black community. And I don't think that's something we can just ignore. So the struggle is not just anti-Trumpism, but it's really about trying to push us forward towards a progressive politics that might be in contrast to what the Democratic Party is fighting for.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this could probably be a departure to a lot of sort of nuanced discussion about sort of mechanisms of change. I agree. I think I would put it, the way I would say it is that electoral politics is not the only route. I think there's a sort of tension, even if sometimes to just expose the inadequacies of the existing system, right? But the fact that we had with all of his problems, and there were many, we had a openly socialist candidate, in the Democratic primary, shifted the discourse in certain kinds of ways. The fact that we have, and I mean, I have to say, I love me some AOC and Rashida Tlaib, and Ilhan Omar. We've done Rising Majority and Movement for Black Lives have done several events with them. These are courageous young women who never set out to be politicians. They were organizers. They have suffered death threats and all. They are a minority. They are not the Democratic Party, but they're a voice in there kind of pushing, exposing, challenging, etc. I don't think their ultimate political home is going to be the Democratic Party.
Right.
And I agree with you wholeheartedly. Any electoral strategy for change has to be in the context of a larger social movement, not the other way around. Because, I mean, we see the sort of compromises, the dilution, the whittling down, that occurs in the Democratic Party, which has been controlled by folks who basically, are funded by very, very wealthy donors and themselves, want to tweak the systems of injustice, but don't really want to undo them. So in the movement for Black Lives Spaces, one thing that has coexisted with a certain tension, which I think is, negotiating or working its way out, is the Electoral Justice Project, which has been again, Black feminist-led electoral process, which helped to get, Cori Bush elected and a number of other progressives working with the Justice Democrats and others. And then the abolitionist impulse, which is critiquing state violence at its fundamental level and really calling us to question, some of the foundational institutions of racial capitalism. So how we work that out, how does the push for certain kinds of changes within the electoral and legislative arena jive with and meld with, but doesn't supersede a larger push for transformative change, which ultimately has to come back to, and this is the portal project that I mentioned, one of its main concerns, ultimately comes back to what are the mechanisms of a just transition? And you and I know how difficult that was in South Africa. And it, the result was pretty disappointing, in terms of the truth and reconciliation process that really left poor and working class and dispossessed South Africans, still in, very close to the positions they were in before, and not at all empowered. So anyway, what last words of wisdom might you like to share, my dear, before we turn it over to Judith again?
Yeah, I'll just pick up where you left off. I mean, I think that it is not just a transition, but it's the process, right? It's how we get there that matters a great deal. And I think that's what the history of social movement organizing teaches us, is that it is fundamentally about a real democratic engagement among people that is not just going to the ballot box and voting, but the ways in which people are invested in and shaping their lives and their societies and their communities. And if I go back to this question of care work that I was talking about, the ways in which care work has been used to recreate inequality, right? I think we also have examples in the Black Lives Matter movement too, the Black Panther Party, in the immigrant rights movement, the ways in which people are creating alternative systems of care that are community controlled. So it's that process of engagement, I think, that is going to fundamentally be the kind of model of a different kind of society that we'd ultimately like to see. But the process of getting there means also implementing that kind of model in our political praxis.
Thank you, Premilla. Thank you for all the work you do, for your long and continuing career. Thank you for loving our people and sharing your brilliance in such a generous way, and for being my friend and comrade for all these years.
Thank you so much, Barbara. It was a pleasure.
Let's turn it back over to Judith to take us into the final stretch.
Thank you both so much. That was such a rich and deep and broad conversation with so much to think about and so much inspiring, and the tough stuff, you talked about the ordinary and the extraordinary happening at the same time. And when Anne talked about backlash, one of the things she said was that feminism started more than 100 years ago, and it's going to keep going for hundreds and hundreds of years more. And the way you've talked about the transformations in movements, the transformations in our world, how we get there, this very daily work with each other in the most micro way, in friendships, in the most macro way. So thank you very, very much. We're so, so happy to have honored you, Premilla. You can find out more about the Anne Snitow Prize at our Facebook page or at our website, AnneSnitow prize.com. We'll be very soon we'll be publicizing when the next year's nominations will be open. We hope that everybody in our audience will think about nominating people. There are, as you were talking, I'm just feeling like there are thousands and thousands of great potential awardees for the Ann Snitow Prize. So in Ann's memory and in thanks to our wonderful speakers today, a wonderful conversation today. Thanks to you all. Congratulations, Premilla, and good night.